Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome. A couple of thanks. First of all, I'd very much like to thank Gresham College. I was Gresham Professor of Divinity for 4 years, and this particular book came out of my last year's lectures, and I know from some of the faces here that you saw at least some of those lectures. Secondly, I would like to thank Sarah Lloyd at Ashgate and her team for producing the book. And I'd also like to thank Gresham College for providing this evening and the reception afterwards. The format for the evening is quite simply, I'm going to introduce the subject for half an hour. Then I'm very glad to say that we have Laura Moffat, who's the Director of Art and Christian Inquiry at the very cutting edge of modern art, who's going to respond for 10 or 15 minutes, and in particular put up a few images that mean a lot to her from a rather different perspective. And then for quarter of an hour we'll open up for general questions and discussions and hope to end pretty sharply at 7, because I know by that point everybody will be absolutely longing for a drink. And over drinks, there, as I'll say a little bit more about at the end, there will be books for sale. But first of all, the theme of the evening. David Jones, that great painter and poet, said that he and all his contemporaries were conscious of what he called the break. And by that he meant, first of all, that the religious and cultural imagery and narrative that had united Europe for 1,000 years had simply dissolved. It was no part of people's natural consciousness. And his theme was reiterated by many other people. Anthony Blunt, better known later in life for other reasons, but also known as the world's leading expert on Claude and a leading art historian, said that he thought religious art could only come from a society in which religious faith was natural to it. And he thought that it had been not natural to it, not only in the 20th century, but in the 19th century. He thought that attempts like the Pre-Raphaelites and the other movements in the 19th century to do something religious actually were artificial. He didn't think there was anything real about them. So artists in the 20th century who wanted to relate in some way to traditional iconography were faced with this huge challenge. There was no unifying Christian narrative or imagery. Traditional Christian imagery had gone dead on people. And as everybody knows, during the 20th century there's been a very rapid and radical series of changes of artistic direction, which is, as it were, compounded the problem. Now, in addition to that, there is the perennial problem of Christian art, and that is, how do you indicate the transcendent through what is finite and tangible? How on earth do you do that? That has, of course, remained part of the challenge. Now, the artists that I consider in my book, some of whose I'll be looking at very briefly this evening, I believe met this challenge, and they met the challenge in rather different ways. And in particular this evening, I'll be looking at what I call the sources of renewal. I'm going to leave each image up for a few seconds just to remind you of it, or so that you can look at it more closely. This is, of course, Jacob Epstein's Ecce Homo, standing in the bombed ruins of the old Coventry Cathedral. Epstein made his living by superb bronzes of people. They're beautifully done, and they were hugely in demand, and he was enabled to live in that way. But his real love was actually carving. And in particular, he was influenced by African carving. He had the largest collection of African carving in Britain at the time. And his early carving very much reflected that kind of style which so much moved and influenced him. He was not alone, of course, in being influenced by the art of other, and in some cases earlier cultures. Cycladic art was one obvious one. Aztec art was another. And these carvings of Epstein, and you can still see some of them on St. James's Park underground. If you look up there, you can still see some of them there. They deeply shocked and offended people, and sometimes people wanted them taken down. And when Ecce Homo was first produced, it aroused an outcry. I don't know whether it was a Daily Mail, it was a similar kind of paper, ranced a story, page after page. They refused in principle even to show an image of it, and it was full of irate letters from readers. Though I'm glad to say that Epstein noticed his Ecce Homos was defended, in fact, by a good number of clergy. A number of Epstein statues aroused such derision that they were bought in and showed in Blackpool Peep Show, believe it or not. Of course, this one did not sell, but it was donated after Epstein's death by his widow Kathleen to Coventry Cathedral. And there, I think it stands, a wonderful, implacable Christ, a wonderfully powerful witness in those bombed ruins. Now, another sculptor who was very much influenced by the art of other cultures was somebody who won't be so familiar to, Leon Underwood. He's been described as the father of modern art, and amongst other people, he taught Henry Moore. I discovered this a few years ago at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town and was very moved by it, and I still find it a very powerful image. Interestingly, Underwood himself travelled very widely in South America in particular and was much influenced by their art. So the first sort of renewal for people who wanted to relate to Christian themes in some way was actually that art of other and in some cases earlier cultures. This is Ecce Homo 2 by Otto Dix, German expressionist, or broadly in the expressionist tradition. And you'll see that there's not only a Christ figure in the barbed wire of a prisoner of war camp, but the artist himself is there within that camp close to Christ, and indeed pointing to Christ. And I'd like to suggest that the second major influence for the renewal of Christian art in the 20th century was an acute consciousness of the suffering of the 20th century. There's very much there in German expressionism, and it is very obviously there in that image of Otto Dix. It also influenced Graham Sutherland. I'm very glad to have some people here this evening from St. Matthew's, Northampton, where this, of course, appears, commissioned by that great rector of St. Matthew's, Walter Hussey. Sutherland was first of all influenced by the landscape of Pembrokeshire, but he wasn't interested in landscape in an ordinary sense. He would pick upon a particular detail, and what he picked upon were the thorns that he saw. And the thorns that he saw came to be, above all, identified with the thorns which were put round the head of Christ. But it was in 1946 that he began in earnest on the crucifixion scene. He particularly wanted to do a crucifixion scene. And he was very influenced at that time by the terribly emaciated bodies of people released from Belsen. And he, like so many artists in the 20th century, were influenced by Matthias Grunwald's great Eisenheim altarpiece. This is Christ being mocked by Rouault. Renewal, who in some ways was the greatest of all 20th century artists painting Christian themes, was acutely conscious of the suffering of the world. He wrote a book called Miserere, Lord Have Mercy, which depicts in a series of deeply moving etchings the poverty experienced in a very, very poor quarter of Paris, the terrible suffering caused by the First World War. He believed that if you stripped away people's masks, the masks of clowns, and he very often pictured people as clowns, if you stripped away the mask of clowns which we all wear, you saw a suffering soul. And I think that he very much brings this perspective to bear in his different paintings of Christ. There's a great poignancy about his depictions of Christ. But what you will also notice about that Renewal, of course, is that there are all sorts of echoes of stained glass, and it's no accident that Renewal began as a stained glass artist. And if the second, as it were, influence on the renewal of art in the 20th century was an acute consciousness of suffering, for certain Christian arts, it was, in fact, stained glass, and in particular, the stained glass of earlier ages. This, of course, as you will recognize, is John Piper's great baptistry in Coventry Cathedral. And John Piper was deeply influenced by the art of the stained glass of earlier ages, particularly Romanesque and Gothic stained glass. He argued that most stained glass produced over the last 500 years that hadn't been art at all, just a poor attempt to reproduce in glass what painters do on canvas. And he said it was in trying to copy a tiny piece of 13th century glass that he really discovered more about what he wanted to do than anything else that he'd done in his life. And he wrote, "We are still fairly new and fervent converts to Romanesque. The brightness of the primary colour contrast, of the primary colour contrast, the geometrical arrangements of not completely geometrical forms within bold black glazing bars, the absence of desire in the makers to achieve any formal recession in drawing or colour, these have provided a sympathetic appeal to the eyes of many in our 2/3 of the 20th century." And that's another example of John Piper. It's his Britain Memorial window in Aldborough of the prodigal son. This may not be quite so familiar to you. It's a deposition by Kerry Richards and is in St Mary's, Swansea. And the next source of renewal that I'd like to point to, it's quite simply the abstract style that became dominant for most of 20th century art. I have just talked about John Piper, and we see an extraordinary kind of coming together with him, because John Piper began at the cutting edge of modern abstract art. He was a member of what was known as, I think it was the 5 and 3 or 7 and 5, which consisted of a certain number of painters, a certain number of sculptors, and the criterion for admission to this very elite group was a huge emphasis upon abstract art. So he began at the cutting edge of abstract art, but because of his earlier love of places, he somehow combined in his life this wonderful love of places, particular places, churches, houses, together with the deep influence that purely abstract art had on him. I think it's Rebecca Harris's book called Modern Romantics, she calls it the most amazing artistic trajectory of the 20th century, John Piper's move. So we must never forget that he was primarily a person deeply influenced by that abstract of the art of the 20th century. And so, of course, was Kerry Richards in this picture. Mel Gooding, the art critic, has said about this, "The dead Christ is laid on a white sheet amidst the mud and debris of a public place. In the Swansea painting, in which the lateral crucifixion of the composition is clearly explicit, scraps of litter are incorporated into the paint, and the carpenter, whose job it is to have made the cross and to have removed the nails, who poignantly reminds of the working profession of Jesus himself, is represented by his work bag, while someone out of the picture to the left shows concern by clasping hands in a way that prefigures a million prayers." Not well known, but I think with Mel Gooding that is a moving picture. Here is a work which is clearly at the cutting edge of modern art. It is Anthony Caro's Deposition, which is in Christ College, Cambridge. Oopsie, sorry. And this is called Still by Alison Watt. It's in the Old Church in Edinburgh. And what I think this brings out, that there are certain contexts in churches where a purely abstract image can be extraordinarily powerful. Richard Holloway, who was vicar of that church for some time, refers to some words which are on the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., a presence at once given and denied. And in this Warriors' Chapel, where the Alison Watt's painting hangs, he describes how Alison Watt went into the chapel and was moved by a special atmosphere still in response to that chapel. And he writes of the painting, "It suggests the presence of a huge absence, the brimming over of a vast emptiness. It glimmers against the grey sorrow of the stone, but does not attempt to subdue it. And the Warriors' Chapel looks as if it had been waiting for it from the beginning. A presence at once given and denied." Now, in addition to the influence of purely abstract art on paintings depicting Christian themes, I would point to another source, rather a vague one, I'm afraid, but what I call in the book an intense personal vision. And the person above all I think I would want to single out is Stanley Spencer. Stanley Spencer said, "When I lived in Cookham, I was disturbed by a feeling of everything being meaningless. Quite suddenly I became aware that everything was full of special meaning, and this made everything holy. The instinct of Moses to take his shoes off when he saw the burning bush was very similar to my feelings. I saw many burning bushes in Cookham. I observed the sacred quality in the most unexpected quarters." And as you know, most of his religious paintings are painted with Cookham High Street or scenes in Cookham as part of the background. A number of times this painting was mistitled with titles like Christ Bearing His Cross. This irritated Stanley Spencer hugely. For him, it was simply Christ carrying the cross. It was him doing his work. We all had work to do. This was his particular work. Here is perhaps my favorite image of Spencer. It's part of his Christ in the Wilderness series, which is in the Gallery of Australian Art in Perth, Western Australia, where Christ is looking down with such pity on the scorpion in his hand. Spencer says, love is the essential power in the creation of art, and love is not a talent. Love reveals and more accurately describes the nature and meaning of things than any mere lecture on technique can do. And it establishes once and for all the final and perfect identity of every created thing. Now, I know that there are people, and indeed it's already been suggested to me this evening, that Stanley Spencer, who could do such exquisite conventional paintings and drawings, and that was how he made his living. They sold like hot cakes, and they are absolutely beautiful conventional paintings, truly lovely. Why did he not stick to this? Why did he bring in what is a kind of distortion in all his most famous religious paintings? But this distortion arises out of his attempt to see life out of love. That's how he saw it. He wrote, distortion arises from the effort to see something in a way that will enable him to love it. And I think you get a good contrast and brings out a little bit of what he means. If there's quite a well-known painting of the crucifixion by William Roberts, which is in the Methodist collection, painted in the tubular style of the time. Now, it's a very accomplished picture, but it's not deeply religious moving. It's as it were part of the style of the time. Spencer was never part of the style of the time. His distortion doesn't arrive in order to conform to some kind of artistic norm of the time. This, quite simply, was how he felt things were. And my own view is that, particularly with a lot, perhaps not so much with this one, but some of his other paintings in that wilderness ceiling, he very often paints a person as to how the person would actually be feeling from inside. So he gets inside the person and how they're feeling from the inside. And I think if you apply that to yourself and you're trying to look at things from the inside, you're aware of the world in quite a distorted way. I mean, I would suddenly be aware of my huge hands in front of me like that. Anyway, this distortion for him, anyway, was nothing artificial, no attempt to conform to any style. It was basically how he deeply felt about things, and it was that way that he loved them. Now, the other painter I was singled out in the book with a very, very distinctive vision is Chagall. This is his white crucifixion in the Museum of Modern Art in Chicago. I'm not going to go into all the iconography of that. It's fairly obvious, and it's in the book if you want, but it is clearly Jesus dressed as a Jew in the midst of the suffering of the Jewish people, which he saw at first hand in Europe in 1938. But the reason why I was interested in Chagall is that he has an intense, what you can only call Jewish mystical feeling about life. He was born and brought up in a shtetl in what was then Russia, a very Jewish part of this little village. And he never lost this sort of intense feeling for life. When he went to to Paris, for instance, he said, I roamed the streets, I searched, I prayed, God, thou who hidest in the clouds or behind the cobbler's house, lay bare my soul, the aching soul of a stammering boy. Show me my way. I don't want to be like the others. I want to see a new world. Actually, it's not Paris, so it's his little town that he'd gone back to, Vibetsk. And in answer, the town seems to snap like the strings of a violin, and all the inhabitants begin walking about the earth, leaving their usual places. Familiar figures install themselves on the roofs and settle down there. All the colours spill out, dissolve into wine, and liquor gushes out of my canvas. Extraordinary, sort of intense, mystical feeling for human existence, which is reflected in so many of his paintings. And some of you will know that this is the east window of the church that he did at Chudley. If you've not seen his wonderful windows in that church, please do go and see them. I've talked a bit about the book, and I'm not going to do that any more because I want to talk about one or two others. So there's this category I've called an intense personal vision, which is not easily categorizable in terms of any artistic style. Neither Stanley Spencer nor Chagall can easily be placed in any of the artistic movements of the 20th century. They had their own very, very distinctive vision. Now, you may perhaps not know Albert Herbert. He was teaching in St. Martin's College at the time when American abstractionism was at its height, and he found himself more and more frustrated by what was going on. And he said, I used to creep down to the etching room in the basement of St. Martin's and work at these little prints, literary, illustrative, with bits of theology, hiding behind childish jokes, all the opposite of what my modernist colleagues were teaching on the top floor. And eventually he learnt to draw again by looking at children's drawings. And this led, he said, to him drawing what I felt and knew rather than what it looked like. Albert Herbert was one of those painters who was very early spotted by the wonderful Sister Wendy Beckett. They are wonderful, they're not well known, but the point of me talking about them this evening is that he had to discover a new style through which he could convey his religious feeling for life. And the way he did it was by looking again at children's paintings. And this is Norman Adams. It's one of the Stations of the Cross that he did for St. Mary's, Mulberry Street in Manchester, little Roman Catholic church there. I think the most powerful set of Stations of the Cross of the 20th century. Norman Adams followed Ruskin in believing that if you had to choose between colour and form, go for colour every time. But nevertheless, he was not particularly, he wouldn't regard them as mutually exclusive. He wrote, subject has always been most important. I cannot start painting unless I'm driven by an almost moralistic idea. Of course, the idea, subject and form must match perfectly, becoming a homogeneous root. And for those of you who are interested, there is a new exhibition of previously unseen Norman Adams paintings at the moment in Guildford Cathedral and in the nearby art gallery on the campus just a few yards away. Some of his wonderful religious paintings which have not previously been shown, and apparently there's a great cache of them in his old house in Yorkshire. This is another Norman Adams that I'm very fond of, called The Golden Crucifixion. Although suffering has been such a powerful theme in Christian painting over the 20th century, Norman Adams, I think, succeeds in doing what few of them doing, and that is bringing up Christian perspective to bear, that the crucifixion is not all there is to be said from the standpoint of Christian faith. And so in that golden crucifixion, you get a crucifixion there, but of course you also get these golden butterflies indicating something risen and transcendent. And because I want to keep to time, I'm just going to show two more of my last ones. This is Roger Wagner. It is Walking on Water 3. You'll recognize Battersea Power Station, of course. I think one of the clues to Roger Wagner, he says that as a teenager, he went to Venice and he saw an exhibition of surrealistic artists, and he was deeply moved and influenced by de Chirico. And all his paintings, although in some ways they are traditional, they're certainly meticulous, they've got a slightly surreal quality about them, because as he says, he wants to indicate there's always something else going on, that although they're set in modern times, it is indicating something else. And the final one that I want to show, which is the last work of Roger Wagner, which is in St. Mary's Church, Iffley, opposite a wonderful window of John Piper. I think all I want to say about that is that Roger Wagner has very much the view of tradition that T.S. Eliot had. That is, it is tradition properly understood that enables you to actually understand and live in the modern world, and that you can use and draw on tradition in highly creative ways. And as I show in the chapter on Wagner, he uses all sorts of influences in this particular wonderful piece of stained glass of Christ on the flowering tree of life. So I think, dear friends, I've had my time. I've kept more or less to time. I'm now going to ask Laura to come up and take the place here for 10 or 15 minutes to respond to that and give a slightly different perspective. And then we'll engage for a couple of minutes and then open up to you.
But yes, thank you, Richard. And I'm sure you'd all want to join me in being one of the first to congratulate you on your book. In considering how to respond to your question, though, of whether today's art can still be deemed to be a friend of religion, I think one of the many issues, perhaps the main issue facing us, is that which you have mentioned already, that of context. The context in which a new work of art is made. And I don't just mean the physical context of a place of worship usually, but the wider social, demographic, and cultural context. I think it drives us to ask what religious life is and how it is played out. Perhaps more specifically, what church is and can be. And I think in that asking those important questions, we find that art, in particular what we might term contemporary art, is extremely adaptable and offers exceptional means of translating, augmenting, and encapsulating our answers. And to illustrate this, I want to show you two works of art which are actually now both over 10 years old, but I think they are exemplary of a contemporary attitude and ability in artists. And coincidentally, they were also joint winners of ACE's Award for Art in a Religious Context in 2007. So, I'm just going to have a sip of water while you look at that. This is a piece by Rose Finkelsey called Angel. It was made in 2004 and was installed only temporarily. I think it was up for 6 months. It was commissioned by an organisation called Art in Sacred Places, and it's on the tower of a church called St Paul's Bow Common, so in East London, part of Tower Hamlets. This is an area I'm sure you probably know of significant deprivation. It's also, there's a large Bangladeshi community in the area, and it sits somewhat ironically and almost literally in the shadow of Canary Wharf. The church itself houses some mosaics by Charles Lutyens, who appears in Richard's book, and they show the angels of the heavenly host alongside the four elements of creation. It's also a church which is often considered as a sort of benchmark piece of post-war British church architecture, and as such a bastion of good taste. I feel I'd probably, forgive me if I'm patronising you, but explain the iconography that's there. This is now actually sort of old technology and teenagers have moved on, but 10 years ago, on mobile phones, you would find young people using emoticons, and this one means angel. It's a zero, a colon, a dash, and a closing bracket. And if you flip it 90 degrees, you'll see the smiling angel with a halo on its head. Now, in making a work of art like this, Finkelsey would, in a mode that's perhaps a little like method acting, submerge herself in a community, in a context. And I happen to know she's still a keen contributor to the church's weekly jumble sales. The work that results appeals across different faiths, ethnicities, and ages. And I think it's capable of referencing art history and popular culture. At the same time, it is simply saying, look at me, look at this church. Something special happens here. It's perhaps a contemporary paraphrasing of the biblical text, part of which you can see there, that runs around the porch. This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And while some might be critical of the work's evasion of any biblical interpretation or Christology, I think it is a very brave and poignant piece of art that doesn't shy away from Christianity, but reimagines its place in multicultural East London. Sorry, I should have shown you this perhaps. So it's made up of thousands of tiny glitter discs which move. They're just held on by a single pin and they move in the wind. So actually when the wind blew, it became a very sort of kinetic piece of work. And it also faced west. So it very often caught the sunsets from the west. The second piece, which I think demonstrates its ability to context, is this altar set within the chapel of St Anselm in Canterbury Cathedral. It's by Stephen Cox, whose methods are clearly more traditional than Finkelsey's. But the work is equally driven by the interrelatedness of different contextual influences. In brief, the altar was commissioned by the people of Aosta in Italy, which is the birthplace of Anselm, and the place from which the stone for the altar was quarried. Of course, this work sits well aesthetically in the environment, but it also exploits the conceptual strength of materials. The stone is allowed to speak in a way that magnifies the incarnation of Christ, his death and resurrection. It is something that will testify for many years to come to the eloquence of materials, space, history, and relationship, brought together in one fluent presence. So lastly, I want to say that far from being the enemy of contemporary religious life, art could in fact play a really vital role in its evolution. It won't be a rehash of the old church's patron story. That time has long gone. But if treated as a symbiotic relationship, artist and church, together with many others involved in the commissioning process, artist and church will be able to offer many rich ways into the Christian narrative.